Welcome everybody to the Living Liberation Conference. My name is Nikita Mitchell. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Chief Strategy Officer for Me Too International. I'm really excited to be hosting this workshop around radical change. So being an agent of change that inspires org transformation. I thought that one of the best ways that we can be in this conversation about what it means to sort of be a champion for org transformation, one of the best ways we can be in that is to actually have a conversation about it. And so I invited Karishi Wigginton. Want to wave to folks, Karishi? Karishi is a part of the Center for Third World Organizing, is the person who made this conference happen. And so we're gonna have a little conversation with one another in just a moment where she's gonna be asking me some questions and then I'm gonna be spilling the tea. Yeah, that sounds good to y'all? Excellent. So Karishi, I'm gonna pass it over to you. Let's see what we can get into around what radical change looks and feels like in organizations.
So first of all, thank you for having me. And I think, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, or one of the things I wanted to know, I think the audience will love to know this, is part of your story, like what brought you to this work?
So I'm from Deep East Oakland, California. And if folks know anything about Deep East Oakland, it's a place filled with hella Black folks, Latino folks, and Pacific Islander folks. Deep East Oakland is a place that is like historically underfunded, and it's like a bunch of like poor folks, right? Poor resilient folks. And so I come from a lineage of like poor Black resilient folks. And growing up, I felt a lot of shame and a lot of guilt around what it meant to be poor and Black. What it meant that my mom couldn't hold down a job, what it meant that, I had to do a bunch of things to make sure that I could eat and that my family can eat. And so I had a lot of shame and guilt around that, a lot of anger around that. And it was really directed towards my family. And I didn't understand that the conditions that we were in were by design. Until I joined youth organizing and educational justice organizing, which I did because I had a little sneaky link, right? And I wanted to hang out with my sneaky link, my little girlfriend behind my mama's back. And so she invited me to this sort of after school situation with this organization called Youth Together. And I like walked in and they were talking about like capitalism and white supremacy and racism. And I just started arguing. I didn't even know what those words meant, right? But I was like, you don't know nothing about that. Like my experience, my story is that like Black folks in my family are lazy, right? Black folks in my family just don't know how to keep a job, right? And they let me argue. And they argued back, right? And so I often say, that like for me, coming into movement was about like having a place to make sense and make meaning of what I was experiencing. It allowed for me to let go of shame and guilt and anger. And it allowed for me to place it in the right place, right? Which was somebody else is making decisions that means that we don't got food on the table. Right? And that if I, along with my peers, my friends, my community can do something about it, then I'm going to do it. Right? And so to me, like finding movement and finding a place to like redirect anger and my love for the folks that I was raised around, for folks I don't even know that were experiencing the same things, is what brought me into movement, what kept me into movement. And after joining educational justice work, I also did union organizing with Unite Here, 2850. Shout out to the airport folks in Oakland. did student organizing, campus organizing with my folks at Mount Holyoke College, got a chance to be a part of Black Lives Matter, and then a series of other things that really have sharpened my commitment to the folks who I think deserve a whole lot. And because of folks' political decisions, don't have access to it. That's a little bit about how, like, what got me in and what kept me into the work.
Dope. I've known you for a long time. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that was even how you got to you together.
Yeah.
So dope. I think like one of the things I think that we have in common is this idea of being a change agent, right? Like, I know that when I join organizations, typically there's a frustration that happens because I ask certain questions and because I bring up the things. It's almost like when you walk in the room, you're like, but there's a big old pink elephant there. Don't nobody see that elephant? We just gonna act like that elephant ain't there. And I always
We be getting into trouble.
it's that Mars thing. It's Mars. Blame it on Mars. But I name the things that need to be named. And often I think people think that I'm tearing the organization or the structure or whatever it is down, but really I'm like iron sharpens iron. Like I'm asking the questions so that we can get to the best aspect of who we are or the work that we're doing. And when I come into a situation, things are going to change. Like it, and it took me a long time. Like I think I got a lot of bruises. Going through like being myself in these spaces, and it took me a long time to realize, oh, that's why, because people are often resistant to change, and when I come in, I'm forcing change. So I want you to talk about, because I think that's some of your experience, so I want you to talk a little bit about that and maybe share an example, some story or something that you have of org transformation.
Yeah, I'm like, definitely for the folks that are may watch this or engage with this, just full context, full disclosure. Karishi is an Aries. I'm a Scorpio. So it's definitely some like, death, rebirth, fire, like we're coming for the transformation. I think before I sort of share an example, the thing that I feel called to share is like, why for me is that important? Like what's at stake? If that's okay, like what's at stake if like we allow for the status quo within our organizations to exist, right? And it's two things for me. One is I grew up in a violent home. And so there's a way that the sort of conditions that allow for violence, that allows for toxicity, that allows for sort of the thing that like rots us at the root, right? I'm hypersensitive to those things, right? I'm hypersensitive to those things. And there's a way that like, because of my experience with violence, because of my experience with, certain things not being said, right? But like, it's all bubbling underneath, like the danger of that, the way I grew up and the danger of things not being named, the danger of things being allowed to remain silent, the danger of not knowing and like the cards not being on the table, right? Around what's going on. Experience that over and over again in my family life created situations for me where I'm very sensitive to what's going on underneath the surface. I'm like hyper vigilant about it, right? And what feels at stake for me often is like my own safety. I want to name it, right? That like sometimes we might notice a pattern, or we might want our organizations to do better. And we might articulate it as, well, we want the organization to be a better organization. We want the organization to have more impact. We want the organization to like move through conflict and discord and tension. And so I found myself saying that in the past without actually rooting it in what's at stake for me. Right. And so I guess I'm starting there, that like what's at stake for me is often like my own sense of safety, my own sense of like what happens for me when confusion exists, How do I feel in my body when there's tension that's not being addressed and acknowledged, right? Those things really drive me towards like asking the hard question, the inconvenient question. Um, and then on the other end of that, right, which is like really rooted in like trauma, right? We just be honest, right? Like it's rooted in trauma. The other end of like why ask the question? Like why do the very uncomfortable, courageous thing, which is to like make like undo and uncover and make a mess of our sense of success, maybe of our organization. Why do that? The other end for me of that is that was actually working in Unite Here. Because for Unite Here, while I was working on the airport campaign as like an organizing fellow, my grandmother, who's also part of Unite Here 2850, her contract was about to be up at the Coliseum, at the Oakland Coliseum. And there's a way that in talking to my grandmother about union organizing, like the challenges of unions, right? And me being like, screw it, I'm just gonna dip. When talking to my grandmother about that, my grandmother reminded me that like her livelihood depends on union organizing, not necessarily the institution of Unite Here 2850, right? But the concept of like doing the hard work, the organizing work, challenging our organizing collectives to do better and be better for our people meant life or death for my grandmother. It meant, will she have health insurance to deal with her diabetes or not? Was on the other end of, am I down? Am I ready to not only not give up, but to ask hard, inconvenient questions for the sake of what I understood in that moment to be life or death for our people. And so I wanted to start there, which I knew was a question later on, y'all, full transparency. But I wanted to start there, right? Around why is it so important? Why being courageous has mattered to me, right?
Can I say something real quick before you go on?
Of course, please.
So it's interesting because I think I don't necessarily think about it in terms of my own personal safety, but when I think about the why, it's like I had a old supervisor years ago say, let's work smarter, not harder. And he was basically saying we had like the things we had to do on our task list didn't shift, even though the university's money that we were getting shifted and the level of staff we could have to work on things was small. Like that didn't change the huge list of things that we had to accomplish. And he was like, well, how do you accomplish them? We have to work smarter, not harder, right? And so that always kind of stayed with me of like that combined with like I think my own idea of like, if we say we're going to do a thing, like let's do the thing, like let's not play. And I think a lot of times we spend our time in organizations playing at something like there's not real stakes on the other end for people, like for what you're talking about, right? So that whatever we're committing to is not just about me accomplishing this goal, it's also personal for the people we're saying it, right? And really we should be working ourselves out of a job, to be honest. Everybody should be approaching the work in that way because it's that dire, it's that critical.
Yeah. I'm like, we have more time. I would love to dive deeper into like what's at stake if we don't work smarter and not harder. Right? Like what's at stake? And that's in both like for our people, for our organizations, like sustainability. If we care about such a thing, there is a world for which we talk about organizations themselves working themselves out of sort of their mission and their purpose. But also what's at stake for us individually, our sense of self, our sense of mental, physical well-being, our sense of success, right? Like oftentimes, like how often for folks watching this, do you actually feel successful? And what's the impact of like having ongoing task lists but never feeling successful? What story does that bring up for you? Right? What triggers does that bring up for you? How do you react to those stories? So I would name that even in that, right? There's something that's both institutional, systemic, and personal, right? That's at stake. Even when thinking about like moving smarter and not harder and like pushing our organizations to do that. So you said an example. Let's see. Let's see. So want to name that. All right. Sorry about y'all. Doorbell. So I think before going into an example, also want to name that like transformation is a process, right? That like for every new set of leaders, members, volunteers, there'll be a new set of questions to answer, right? There'll be a new set of sort of dynamics to uncover, undo, develop, and transform within an organization. And so by all means, any example I'm about to share don't mean that we're at the pinnacle, right? But yeah, I would say that like the example that comes to mind is the current organization that I'm a part of, which is Me Too International, right? So for those who don't know, Me Too International is an organization that was sort of thought about and created as a program in 2006, I believe, by Tarana Burke. And then with the explosion of the hashtag, sort of transformed, the organization transformed and solidified into sort of a movement organization with the goal of harnessing the sort of voices and power of survivors towards a set of political interventions, right? Political and communal intervention. And so when I think about like change, I think about, I'm like, let's just be direct. Yeah. I think about the culture. So we are an organization that is ran by Black women. And the culture, the way that Black women have been socialized to be superheroes, to be saviors, to do everything, but to be silent in the midst of it all, right? That culture was undergirding all of the work, right? It was sort of creating a sense of like false urgency, creating a sense of perpetual disappointment, right? Around impact, scale, depth. Are they talking about us? What are they saying about us, right? How do we address that? Like it was creating a culture where we were hamsters, right? Going on and on and on a wheel that we didn't control, right? There is no way that we can appease people who morally oppose to a world free from sexual violence. We're not going to be able to appease them. We're not. There's no way that you can out organize or out sort of converse with people like beyond where, in a lot of ways, beyond their stuckness, right? Around their own story. That's a journey. That's a process, right? Navigating your own story. What does that mean? Like, do you want to join the movement? Are you ready to join the movement? Where are you at on your healing journey? We can't outrun that, right? But that's a journey. And so in a lot of ways, we were sort of producing for a group of people or for a set of conditions that takes time to change, right? And when we were not able to, get the numbers that we want or get the media hits that we want or have thousands of people in our programming, we would turn that into ourselves around our own skill, our own commitment, our own like failure around being able to be a savior, right? And that culture, that cycle was creating conditions of extreme burnout within the organization, right? Also, just on some basic, creating a culture of like, what's that called? Like stress and like snickering and, like,
It's like an unhealthy culture.
Like an unhealthy culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, in noticing that, at the time where I was the interim program director and noticing that culture, there was a few things that I did, right? One was fight to slow down the work, which was a fight, right? Like until we are clear about our own why, we're clear about our own sort of metrics of success that's divorced from the gaze of like white supremacists, divorced from the gaze of patriarchy, divorced from the gaze of even movement folks, self-righteous movement culture, right? Like until we're clear about who we are and what we intend to do and what our lane is, divorced from those things, we got to slow down so we can actually answer those questions, right? And so as a leader in the organization, I was like, where can I cut corners? Where can I say we're not doing that right now? Right? That's next year's business. How do I sort of assert what it takes to actually make something happen? Like how many folks have been like asked to create an organizing strategy or get 1,000 people out to this meeting, and you're like, yeah, okay, I can, and the timeline you're given is like 2 weeks. It don't take 2 weeks to do that. It don't take 2 weeks to do that. It does not take 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 3 months to create trauma-informed survivor-led programming. Right? That takes time, both for the participants to see themselves in a program that actually is holding them, but also in a way that then holds our staff team, right? And so I slowed down the work and I had some really hard conversations about where can we cut corners, where can we move something over so that we give ourselves the time, the spaciousness, and the permission to do a set of things well, right? And in order to do that, I had to ask some really hard questions. What's really behind this for you? Why do you want this to happen in this time frame? Whose story are you listening to, right? I had to ask myself, how much of this is about my own validity as a leader, right? How much of producing, getting the work out is so that I can feel valid in this capitalist structure, right? As like a worker. So it meant asking some really hard, uncomfortable questions of leadership, of myself and of my staff team, right? And another way that we sort of address the culture of like, Black woman saviorship, the culture of urgency, the culture of like rapid production, was that we also slowed down in order to get clear about our SMART goals. And I know that like SMART goals seem really basic, right? They're like, like they're not necessarily necessary. And for folks who don't know what SMART goals are, SMART goals essentially mean creating goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound, right? So we slowed down to be like, what does success actually look like? I do not believe that we can retain our people, that we can sustain our work, that we can feel good about our work if we cannot create conditions for which small and big successes are possible. And that's both programmatically and on our organizing work, on our fundraising work, whatever field of work you're in as it relates to movement. If we cannot create conditions where we feel successful, where our folks feel successful, they won't stick around. And so a part of slowing down and a part of sort of letting go of and like challenging the narrative that like Black women need to be superheroes was also being really clear about what does success mean for us. And so Karishi knows this because Karishi and I were working on this project for Me Too, where we walk through the program from our own vantage point. How do we want to feel? We were not pulling ourselves out of it. How do we want to feel if we just saw this program, right? How do we want to be on the end of it, right? And that allowed for us to create goals that we also could find pleasure in. And I'll just name here that I think that we have, as a culture, divorced pleasure from our work. We've divorced our work from what feels good to us. And if it doesn't feel good to us, if it doesn't feel pleasurable to us, if it doesn't inspire us, right? If it doesn't challenge us to grow, then why do we think that will be the same for our people? Right? And so we slowed down and we created some SMART goals so that we could feel good and pleasure about what we were creating, and that we were clear about what success meant. So that when we get on a call with a funder, we got on a call with leadership, we were saying very clearly, this is our metric of success, not this other thing. Right? Not this other thing, not this thing that's not grounded in an honest assessment of time, place, and conditions, that's not really grounded in the numbers, not that. This is our best hypothesis about what's possible, about what success looks like, which then allow for us to let go of everything else that was not in relationship to that success. And then the last bit that, I sort of did or tried to create the conditions of is to, like, again, get underroot that narrative or uproot that narrative around like black woman savior, is we also created an environment where folks could ask questions, where they can be uncertain, unsure, where it wasn't just me asking her questions of leadership, but I was also open to being asked hard questions as a leader myself, right? Where folks can bring to the table, what it meant to be tired, right? What it meant to be tired, what it meant to be overwhelmed, mad, right? And so we created a culture where, whether it be through our check-in questions, we ask those questions at the beginning as we solidify the team. What pisses you off? Right? What pisses you off? What does trust look like for you? How do you build trust? Right? Are you trusting? Right? So that we could create a culture where ultimately folks were able to name at the beginning when something was going off the rails for them, instead of assuming that because our purposes are aligned or folks are aligned with the mission and the vision of the organization, that they would actually be comfortable enough to be an agent of change in the organization. That's something you actually have to cultivate in an organization, especially, for those of us that are not ruled by Mars, right? You actually have to create a culture where folks feel like they can be agents of change. And my assessment is that in movement organizations, that doesn't actually exist. We're asking folks to be powerful beings and to cultivate power out in the world, but to be silent in their own organizations, right? To be mad silently in their own organizations. And that what we know is that folks with the tools of organizing and disruption are going to bring it home if the culture at home in our organizations aren't actually making space for them to be powerful beings, right? And so we created a culture of folks themselves in the work can be empowered, and not just what was expected for them to then perform out in the world. So those are some of the things that we did in Me Too during that time to sort of articulate what culture we actually wanted to have, and what change was needed in order to get there.
It's interesting. I think as you're talking, some of the things that came up for me, I remember Celeste saying something was happening in her life, and she was saying, like, I'm also part of the most impacted, right? And I think we often forget that, like, the people who are doing the work are often reflective of the people we're working on behalf of, right? And so those same challenges and traumas and all this stuff is in the room and at the table with us too, right? And so it's even more pressing when you're talking about what's at stake, like the idea of not having a culture where you can bring all of that in the room with you. It's in the room with you anyway, right? It's taking up space. It's impacting how you talk to people, how you look in, how you're approaching the work and all of that. But if there's no room to speak about it, like to share it, to work through it, then it just builds up like its own monster. And then the other thing I was thinking when you were talking is that in like added to that whole thing, and my assumption is that other people of color deal with this, but I definitely know that Black women deal with it. This idea that we can't fail, right? And so not only are you the superwoman, but like the whole world rests on your shoulders, and so you can't fail. And in that also our self-esteem gets it gets like our validation comes from like output. And so the idea of you slowing everything now, wait a second. We're supposed to do 50 things that other people can only do 10 things of in the same amount of time, because that's who we are. And then what does it mean for me as a Black woman, if I can't do that, or if I don't do that?
Yeah. Just want to name this piece around, like go deeper a little bit around this piece around failure, which is that for myself, right? I am 28. I'm 28. I have been everything from like a operations coordinator to a director of an international organization, right? And I'm only 28. And there is a way that for those of us that might be coming into the work younger, there is a way that we're expected to know things that we just don't know. There's some things we just don't know. There's some things that have been in the work, folks who've been in the work for a long time that just don't know. We don't know. Because if we knew what we needed to know, all the things, then we would be in the world that we're envisioning, right? We don't know some things. And also failure is a part of the work, right? And so there's been so many times where I haven't spoke up or asked a question or challenged it because I was scared that I didn't know the answer, right? I didn't know the answer. I didn't know something that I thought other people should know or did know, or I didn't want to seem like a failure. I didn't want to seem like I didn't care, I wasn't committed, and I didn't want to fail, right? And the truth is that like a part of, like when we think about design thinking, a part of design thinking, and Celeste used to say this, Faison used to say this, which is fail fast. Mm-hmm. And see failing fast as a part of the work, as a valid, critical step, right? To doing even more miraculous, beautiful, impactful work. It's failing fast and letting go of the sense that like, that's not possible. And I'll name that like, over the years, I've been able to meet folks, in tech industries, right, but whatever, in tech industries or in corporate America who they know the value of failure. Mm-hmm. They know the value of failure. They know the value of sort of figuring out what is each person really good at. They know the value of creating culture where folks give regular input and feedback to a thing, where things are done collaboratively, right? Because that's what's going to get them the best product. And for them, make them the most profit, right? And so for me, I'm like, how do we create cultures where folks are not scared to ask the question because they feel less than, where they're also willing to fail in the work, right? And that if we could do that, then we can create cultures where the work is less mysterious, which means more folks are sort of seeing themselves as critical, valuable players in the work, right? So if we're like, you have to know all of this language to even get into the door, then how can we effectively keep our people? My grandma don't know this language. She don't know half of the stuff I talk about, she don't understand, right? However, how do we create a culture for her to see herself as an agent of change, which means our organizations have to be a lot more spacious than what they already are, right? So just wanted to name a little bit more there.
Definitely. I think the one thing I would ask, I think like the last question, because you basically touched on all the questions. And you even gave us some tools that I'm going to put together as a nice little toolkit for the people. But the one thing is that there's challenges and where you failed, and how did you work through those failures. So you just gave us permission to fail, but I'm wondering if you can close us out with like one brief example of some challenges that you had faced and how you failed and how you were able to come through that.
Ooh, I done failed many times. So I'll give an example. So the example that comes to mind is that Me Too was writing its social and political framework, which answers the question, who are we as an organization? What is our analysis of the problem? And I was on a team of people that was writing this document for the organization. And we were in a conversation. So again, I'm like, ask the hard questions. Go for it, right? Leave no crumb on the floor. And I remember we were at this place in the framework where we were trying to figure out the language to articulate somebody who has perpetrated sexual violence. It's going to sound like an interesting example, but bear with me. And folks were like harm doer or person who caused harm or right, or some other language. And I got so triggered. But I didn't acknowledge that I was triggered. It did not dawn on me that what was about to come out of my mouth, right? My natural habit of asking questions, challenging the status quo, right? That all of that was about to come out of my mouth was not actually a grounded question. It wasn't a grounded comment, right? Because I have the gift of gab, where I can frame something in a way where you think it's a valid thing to consider, right? So I start talking about, I really want to challenge us, and Karishi knows this, when I start saying that, I really want to challenge us around this word or this language, right? And I think we should go, I think that we should center very strong language that really calls out what this is and what's at stake and what's impactful. And we should use the word rapist. And that to me was an example of what it meant to move from a triggered and ungrounded place. And I name that as a challenge or as a failure because as folks who really care about the work that we do, that really cares about the impact we want to make, that see ourselves as agents of change in our organizations, the greatest thing that I've come across is my own triggers and trauma being the thing getting in the way of me being the type of leader I want to be, even in the midst of org transformation, right? That how I have in moments of my own triggers and traumas and sense of lack of validation, how I've centered myself in the conversation about where the organization should go, what the organization should do, what the organization should say, right? How much of what comes out of my mouth around how the organization should transform is about something solving within myself versus the community, the impact, the movement work we are all committed to doing, right? And so I'll name that one of the biggest challenges has been my own understanding and getting more familiar with my own ego, my own triggers, my own trauma, so that the transformation in our organizations is rooted in our people, not in me, right? Or not in any other leader. And the tool that I used was therapy, y'all. Therapy. Which I can share with folks some like free therapy offerings as a part of this thing, therapy. Also like I think visualizing, like learning how to visualize, hey y'all, I'm triggered in this moment. So the things that's about to come out of my mouth is grounded in a feeling. It's a feeling. It's not an assessment. I didn't look at the numbers. I'm not checking out what the mission statement is. This is a feeling. And I need to say it, right? Having folks that are outside of the organization that I can talk to, right? I want us to do this thing. And folks being like, is that the mission? Is that what you signed up for? Right? Are you okay, Nikita? You need help, support? What do you need to come back into this work, into this transformational work that requires a lot of courage? What do you need so that you can be courageous? And you could be open, you could be vulnerable, you could be brave, you could be decenter yourself in your ego, right? Have been things that I've really deeply relied on in moments where I want to shift the tide of the organization behind my own ego. So that's a challenge that I've found that I've been listening into and leaning into more.
Woo, that is some stuff. So I think that is our time. You gave us such great nuggets. So the homework that I'm going to give is you stated it, but it's the SMART goals. So I'm going to have them outline their SMART goals. I'm going to have them define what success is, and it could be in general, but it also can be for tasks. And then also what does success look like? So those are going to be the things that I put out there for them. Thank you so much, Nikita. This has been amazing.
Thank y'all for having me. Thank y'all for listening and holding space. Hopefully this conversation creates more room for you to be the leader that you want to be, the change agent that you want to be. And I'm really excited for all the work that folks are doing, and thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.